My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasakaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today we are now getting into more interesting discussions between Lord Yama and Lord Yama and Nachiketa. And if you see the front screen here, actually, he takes Lord Yama takes Nachiketa through really defining what self is. Most often we know what our body is, we know all those things, but the self is very subtle, right? So here, if you see in the front page, it says that the self is subtler than the subtle, greater than the great. It dwells in the heart of each living being. He who is free from desires and free from grief, with the mind and senses tranquil, behold the glory of the Atman, the Brahman here. He says that the mind holds the key to everything. If we are so caught up with this material world, materiality, we lose grip of that spiritual realm. But the whole art of living is to divinize everything. He says one who is able to divinize this is able to attain that highest abode of that. So here, he says that the wonderful thing he says is that this self cannot be attained by studying or very theoretical, academic exercise. He says that it has to be, it cannot be an intellectual kind of a discourse, by hearing. He says that one needs to experience this self, but to experience the self, one needs to know what this self is about. He says only those who are able to experience it will know what the true self is. So here, Lord Yama takes Nachiketa through understanding and becoming aware of the self, right? So he says that in this, he actually describes that, this wonderful, a subtle, very, very, it's very difficult to, know this by theoretical or academic pursuit. It has to be an experiential spiritual pursuit. So this is, so in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through that very important conversation that he's describing between the gross body and the subtle body. Although we have covered some element of it, he goes now into much more detail. So what we're going to do is that, in the last session, we covered about the individual self, which is primarily, identified with its materials, material body, materials, personality. And then you have got this cosmic self, which is transcendental to this material self, right? And most human beings are so caught up with this individual self, the individual personality. And very few become aware of that cosmic self. So here in this part 2 of chapter 2, he takes him through this journey of this spiritual, this intellectual that is embedded with that spiritual DNA to help that mind and the intellect that is so entrenched in this materiality to going deeper within oneself to touch that subtle. But he explains this in a very kind of like how a teacher does step by step, So here he says that, he now talks about, in this part, he talks about the body. He says the body has, 11 openings, right? And I think all of you all can count and you know what those openings are. He says, which is unborn and always same of the pure consciousness. So though the body has that, he says that the self, the body is born. So there is a conception, and then you have the fertilization that takes place, and then you have the fetus, and then, 9 to 10 months, you see that the baby is born. So yes, the body emerges. So there is a beginning. For a short while it is there, and then it's dissolved. So he says body goes through that dynamics. That's the physics of the body. It's caught up in space and time, right? He says that, the body with its 11 opening is the abode of the self, you see, and within that body, that self is that. that present. And he says that the self is neither born and it's in the pure state of consciousness. And it's very interesting. You see, the body goes through this evolution, but very interestingly, we see that the self, which is embedded, which is the cosmic intelligence. I wondered, about this passage very, very carefully. He says that if you think about it very clearly, he says that when fertilization took place, there was a cosmic intelligence that caused that fertilization. And then there was a process. As soon as the fertilization takes place, you have this process, scientists call meiosis and mitosis, the replication of that cell as cells. And ultimately, by the time 9.5 months, 10 months, you see that, the baby is born. All this takes place, because of that cosmic self, right? Yes, we human beings have to do it. Yes, the mother eats the food, but the assembly of the body takes place through this cosmic intelligence. And the same thing when the child is born. You see that, of course, the doctors are there, the midwife is there, but the first breath, who teaches the child, right? So there is a cosmic intelligence that enables the child to now become independent of the mother in that breathing process, the first breath. Right? And you see, go on, you see that there is something underlying that body. We can call it pure consciousness. Ultimately, after a while, we see that our material personality forms and develops. And oftentimes, we slowly lose that cosmic intelligence because we're so caught up with the material identity. We lose that cosmic identity. So he says that because, there's a transition that takes place, that all this while there is this cosmic intelligence of pure consciousness guiding us. And then as part of being in this material world, we see that the physics of the material world takes place. The software called the mind forms. It gives us a personality. And we see that now we're on an autopilot. We form our material personality. But over time, most people, at least in the olden days, people used to go back and do meditation and practices that reconnects back to that pure consciousness or the spiritual or the cosmic intelligence. But today we see that from young onwards, with all the modernity, we see that people are so entrenched with materiality, right? Every moment of waking is bombarded with material things, from our mobile phones to everything. We have AI and all those things. So the mind is so entrenched with this materiality, it loses its way to getting back to the cosmic intelligence, right? So we see that, and this is why when the mind is so caught up by the material identity is anchored on that material body that has got, finite time. And it's caught up by birth and death, sukha dukkha cycles. So because the mind is so wedded and welded to the body that is caught up by birth and death, the mind also goes through that cycle of sukha dukkhas, the nice feeling and then the down. Because the mind is so caught up by the gravity of this materiality, right? So Lord Yama is explaining to Nachiketa why most people find it very difficult to understand the transcendental state of their existence, which is the cosmic intelligence, because all their lives they're trained to be caught up and allured by the desires of materiality. Hence, it's very difficult for them to break away from that. So they're caught up in this birth-death cycle. He says that only an enlightened one will be able to break this cycle. So he explains this. So that ability to have that mind that is viveka, ability to discriminate between what is real and unreal, what is changing, unchanging, what is fleeting and what is transcendental. So here it requires a fair bit of, self-development, self-discovery, a stelch of a mind to be able to break away from that gravity of materiality. You know, when the spacecraft is wanting to beat the gravity of the Earth, you know, the amount of thrusters that is put, and once it breaks the gravity, the thrusters now can drop off, and you see very little energy is needed to navigate through space. In that same way, the human mind that is caught up by the gravity of materiality find it hard to break away from that cycle of birth and death, the Sukha Dukkha cycle. So one would need the boosters to help the mind bend inward through introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation to be able to break away from this gravity. Ultimately, the mind that is wedded and welded to the material personality, you know, slowly transition towards becoming one with that cosmic intelligence. And you see that when that happens, something very interesting happens. You feel more peaceful, you feel more liberated, you feel more happy, you know, and not be caught up by, you know, all those material, you know, personality and the ego. So here he explains this this birth death cycle because, you know, the ordinary human beings are so caught up by this material personality. Though in the beginning that cosmic intelligence was so important to give rise to this material identity. And for everyone, the material body too will shed. So it goes on to explain this, you know, with some, and I try to put some pictures to give you that illustration. So he says that the self is everywhere, right? So if it is transcendental to the body, then even before the body formed, even before fertilization took place, if it is the cause of the fertilization of all our lives, it must be present before that. So here the scriptures explain that the self is everywhere. It is part of the sun. It is part of everything in this universe, right? From the birth of the universe right up to the you know, building blocks of the universe, you know, the energy, the weak forces, the gravitational forces, the electromagnetic forces, you know, the basic building blocks of helium, hydrogen, and then all the other elements in the periodic table. And then we see that formation of more you know, advanced molecules and complex molecules, including formation of new planets and galaxies and suns, and eventually, you know, you have planktons and complex life form, including us. So everything is powered by that self, right? So very nicely he says, it is in the minutest thing, the smallest of the smallest, from the beginning of the universe to the weak forces to the smallest, you know, quarks, right up to the grand universe itself, right? And that presence is manifest as that self. So he explains this. He says everything in the universe is a manifestation of that divinity. Call it whatever you want. Call it God or whatever you want to call, right? But he says the self is an expression of the divinity, right? The mere fact that our consciousness itself is the expression of the divinity. And that's what this passage is saying, that all of us are part and parcel of this universe which divinity is embedded. We are all divinity packaged differently, right? So, and why this is really important, later I'll speak about it, see, is that in this passage he explains everything in this universe is a manifestation of the divinity or the self or the Brahman or God. So he says that the self, you know, the self is what gives life. The self is what is, you know, makes us breathe. The first breath that we take, you know, when we come out of our mother's womb, our mother has been supporting us. The moment we come out, the first breath that we take, the prana, and then the apana that we breathe out, that flow that gives us life, right? He says, that's by that self. Even when we are sleeping, right? The breath continues, right? We have no control of the breath. The breath is an automatic function of nature for every existing being, biological being. He says that that is also the self. It's in our heart, and every organ is being powered by that. The moment the breath stops, everything stops, right? So he explains that, we are breathing the universe in us, and we are breathing the universe outside. We are just a vessel where the power of the universe is flowing through, right? And if the mind recognizes the flow of that infinite universe in us, and the mind holds on or catches that wind of that infiniteness, the mind becomes infinite. This passage reminds me so much of someone who is, has a sailboat, right? So the sailboat is like our body and our mind, and the wind is that divinity, the breath or the prana. We may have the most sophisticated boat, but if we don't know how to catch the wind, we are not going to go anywhere. But even though if you have a rickety-rackety boat, right, and you have a mast with a simple cloth, if you know how to catch the wind, you will be able to sail far and wide. In that same way, that breath occurs, the wind continuously flows through us. When the human mind is able to catch that wind of that infinite possibilities and potentialities, the mind rises to that level, right? When the mind is unable to capture that, even how much the flow takes place, it will always go in circles. Will always be caught in the Sukha Dukkha cycles, will always be caught in the birth-death cycles, right? So Mahan and all these great saints, including Lord Yama, is telling Nachiketa, dear Gautama, learn to know the flow that is coming in and coming out. That flow is nothing but that self-directed, vital Brahman, that breath, the divine breath. Learn to catch that. To catch that, one needs to let go that gravity of materiality and be absorbed in that flow of the divinity. He says that if one does that, you see that the mind slowly becomes transcendental to the limited material identity and falls to become one with the universe itself. Beautifully, he explains in this passage. Then he goes on to explain that this self, when the self is detached from the body, right, and it leaves the body, what remains, right? As long as the self remains in the body, the value of the body is immense. He says, when the self leaves the body, you see that the corpse, when someone is alive, you say, oh, have you seen so and so? You talk about that person, the human person, with so much value and reverence. When the self leaves or becomes detached from the body, we call it the corpse, right? And you see that the natural process is initiated by nature, but the decay process, the dissolving of the body, which was assembled during, life and during our normal, from birth onwards, from conception onwards, we see the assembly, continuously forming the body. We eat, we breathe, we get sunlight, all that forms the body. The self actually builds that body. The moment the self decouples from the body goes through its evolution to go back. The dissolution takes place and goes back to nature. So he says that, when this embodied self detached from the body and leaves the body behind, what remains? Nothing else remains, right? He says that true self, he says, he asked Nachiketa, so what is there left, right? They can't carry themselves, others have to carry them. The life becomes absolutely nil, right? He says, what gives humans that value is that self, right? That cosmic intelligence. He explains this. He says, nobody, can survive. No mortal being can survive by his vital breath. There is, yes, we have the birth, we are breathing, but that alone is not enough. He says, there are people that, they're still alive, but the soul is not there. He says there is something else that sustains the person, right? Yes, there is something that sustains that birth, the prana, the vital breath, the prana and the apana, right? He says, but that alone is not enough. He says, there must be something else. What is that something? He says, where both the prana and apana are dependent on it. It is that self itself. He says, so here he explains what that self is. So while the self is critical for that body to sustain itself through breath, through this, inhalation and exhalation, and the flow of the energy within the body. He says that which sustains this flow is very important. So the breath is dependent on that self, right? And he says that the self is that which gives us consciousness, gives us illumination, and gives us what we call existence itself in this material world. So treasure that. But we get so focused on the material experiences, the material personality, not realizing that there is something far greater than material identity. So here he explains that Nachiketa, focus on that which powers everything. Right? For this, one needs that introspection, regular introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So he explains this duality between the materiality and the spirituality. Yet the whole realm of materiality is supported by the spiritual realm, which is that self itself, right? So here he describes that. And going through this, I always reflect, what is the self? It's actually the spiritual, silent entity that is in us that is not affected by, space, time, material things, the Sukha Dukkha cycle. It's absolutely quiet, that quietude. In that quietude, that silence, we get an expanded state of our existence, everlasting state of our existence, not caught up by our limited identity, our material biological identity. In that we attain a liberation, kind of not affected by liberation from that Sukha Dukkha cycles and from the birth death cycles. And if those three doors of silence, expansion, liberation, ultimately leads to the finality. I am that. Aham Brahmasmi. I am that Brahman. I am that infinite divinity that is in everything and everything is in me. So the mind becomes that powerful and kind of attains the infinite possibilities and potentialities. Why this is really important? Because when the mind is entrenched with that, the mind acquires that spiritual capital, the spiritual knowledge and the spiritual capital, and all other knowledge becomes very easy to access. And I'll speak about this. I've spoken about this, but I'll reinforce that in this coming satsangs. So he goes on to explain in this passage, O Gautama, I shall now explain the duality between material things and the spirituality, that individual self and the cosmic self. Both are part and parcel of our existence. He says, now I shall explain to you the subject the secret of that eternal Brahman. Now it's going to go much more deeper. You know, what happens after the self? What happens to the self after death? Right? So this is the original question he asked. What happens after death? So in the next few passages, he will explain, which I'll cover in the next classes, but I'll give you a little bit of hint to read ahead. Right? So he says there are two things, right? Two things that he explains. First, the nature of the Brahman, that self, the cosmic, how the Brahman can be attained, how the mind can hold on, number one, become aware, grasp it, integrate it, and become one with it. So he says that that's the first part that I'm going to show you, right? The second part is that once you know that, then the question that you ask me, he's telling Nachiketa, the question you ask me, what happens to the self after death of an individual? That will become very clear. So, but I have to explain to you what the nature of the Brahman is and the characteristics of the Brahman. And I think he covered bits and bytes in the earlier passage, but here he will bring it all together, right? And he says, not only knowing the nature of Brahman is important, most people will know it theoretically, academically, right? But he says, I will show you how to experience it, attain it, and the mind expanding to the state of the Brahman itself, the silence, the expansion, the liberation, and the finality, right? And once you know that, he says, you will know what happens. It will open the answer to the question that you ask. What happens after death? So he says these two questions are, for me, it's like the research questions in any research, What is the nature of the Brahman? How can we attain it? What happens after self? So these are questions a scientist and researcher will ask, right? So he says, because we don't ask the right question, in this Brahman or this divinity is surrounded by a lot of mystery. And he said most people don't know anything about it, have no idea. They have some notion of what it is, but they, have a very kind of a abstract understanding or an academic understanding. He says only the trained, only the ones that experience, only the one who pursued that knowledge transition the mystery into the mastery of that Brahman. What was a mystery now becomes a mastery of that Brahman. He says, this is why it is a secret. Not everybody knows. It remains a mystery for many, many people. Only for the selected ones, it becomes a mastery. So he says that, but whether people know anything about it or not, Brahman is there. So whether you are enlightened or not enlightened, the Brahman is there. The difference is that the enlightened ones know it is there and is able to access it and live a wonderful universal life. The others have the treasure, but live a life with a lot of sukha dukkha cycles and turbulence. He says this is the difference. So in the next session, I will describe in more detail how Nachiketa explains, how Lord Yama explains to Nachiketa the Brahman, what it is, how to experience this, and how to be fully actualized in it so that you know what life is, what is transcendental, what is transitory, what is permanent, what is impermanent, what is mortal, what is immortal, what is finite, and what is infinite. And this is what we will cover in the next few classes. Hopefully by the end of this, in the Katha Upanishad, you will know who you are and you live a wonderful, creative, superb life without not being tormented by, the vagaries of life that most people go through. With that, Sandosham.